Balancing in video games is hard, and TF2 is no stranger to this, rocking well over 100 unlockable weapons spanning over the last 14.5 years with countless tweaks to balance. It's fascinating seeing the evolution of stats these weapons take on, as well as how far they've strayed away from their initial release. But that's Valve for ya. You never truly knew what they were thinking when they were tweaking weapons. Like, who thought to give the Short Circuit a fucking energy blast? But then you've got weapons like the Degreaser, which in its current state is arguably the strongest flamethrower, but at the same time the least unique. Compare it to everything else. The Backburner, the Phlogistinator, and especially the Dragon's Fury. These unlocks work like true side grades, as they benefit certain playstyles while punishing others. Whereas the Degreaser just has an increased switch speed combined with pitiful downsides. And you may be asking, well, what exactly makes the Degreaser so dead then? And to answer that question, let's go through the history of the Degreaser. TF2 in its early years was very different from how it is today. You've got subtle differences like Pyro's initial lack of air blast, broken weapons like the auto-clicker pistol, as well as dice roll mechanics like random damage spread. But one subtle difference that I don't see being talked about too much would be weapon switch speed, which actually used to be so much slower than it is today, sitting at 2/3 of a second just to switch from one weapon to another. And you can see the impact this had from how sluggish old TF2 gameplay looked. But then 2010 rolled around, which saw a lot of new games hit the market. But TF2, a nearly 3-year-old game at the time, released one of its most influential updates. That, of course, being the Manconomy update, which introduced a lot of things to TF2. Pay-to-win item sets, cosmetic slot machines, as well as promotional items, just to name a few. But in terms of new weapons, you've got game-changing additions like the L'Etranger and Mad Milk. But I don't think any of these weapons truly came close to what the Degreaser brought to the table. And that's honestly a bold statement, especially for a weapon that only had two defining stats: faster switch speed and reduced afterburn, which on the surface don't look like too much to write home about, but there's a lot more going on in the details. As I previously stated, TF2's base switch speed during this era was 2/3 of a second, but with the Degreaser's boost to that, it actually dropped all the way down to just under 1/4 of a second, which, believe it or not, made quite the impact. But it didn't just stop there. Instead of simply having this switch speed benefit just the Degreaser, it actually benefited Pyro's entire loadout. Not only was this great for reacting to spam, but was also useful in distance fights, as you could switch to your secondary much faster than before, giving you more of an opportunity to land your shots, if random bullet spread doesn't eat half of them. But as for the afterburn penalty, well, it certainly made the Degreaser the weakest flamethrower for raw damage, but the difference was basically non-existent anyway. Together, this puts the Degreaser in a bizarre state. It's incredibly effective in defensive scenarios, but just a tad weaker in the typical WM1 playstyle. But there was another, much more interesting way to use this weapon. Taking the Degreaser's switch speed boost and pairing it with weapons that dealt full critical hits on burning players made for one of the most unique playstyles ever seen for Pyro, especially for the rather lacking options you had back then. This allowed for you to use your flamethrower not as a DPS weapon, but as a tool of ignition, allowing for your other weapons to be the real damage dealers of your loadout. However, I'm not going to deny that the most basic of combos were still doable with just the regular roll flamethrower, but the Degreaser had one final trick up its sleeve. With careful timing, you were able to land these critical hits on opposing Pyros, something that was mechanically impossible up until this point unless you had another Pyro keep your target on fire, which wouldn't realistically come into play. And things only got crazier with the addition of the detonator, allowing for Pyro to easily close gaps and dive bomb players, leading to some of the most utterly insane kills the class can perform. But that was simply a flex to an already pretty powerful combo. One cannot deny how much the Degreaser revolutionized Pyro, taking them from a short-range target to a quick-switching threat, which in the right hands could absolutely demolish the opposing team. However, darker times are on the horizon. There's no denying that the original Degreaser was a bit broken. Its penalty was utterly pathetic in comparison to its switch speed boost, plus it wasn't exactly clear as to what this weapon was actually meant to do, which I understand can be a pointless argument, but most unlocks are designed to add specific niches to the class they are for, and unfortunately, this Degreaser just didn't have it. But Valve wasn't just gonna leave it like that, were they? Pyromania was quite a forgettable update. I mean, sure, it gave us Meet the Pyro, but the actual meat of the update just wasn't that game-changing, especially in comparison to the behemoth that was Man vs. Machine that released just a couple of months later. But that's not to say that there weren't major changes in this update. Look at the equalizer. But I do find it odd though that Pyro was barely tweaked in this update, with the only general balance tweak being a 10% damage buff for all flamethrowers. But that begs the question, what was Valve's idea for tweaking the degreaser? Drum roll please. Valve's idea for balancing the degreaser was giving it a 10% damage penalty. That's right, the degreaser was basically unchanged as these tweaks canceled each other out. The degreaser was still a very safe option that could be used in basically every scenario as stock, but it certainly had the potential to be a powerful and balanced weapon. It just needed to be more situational, but it would take a critical look at the weapon to really form what the degreaser should become. Tough Break. One of the biggest balance updates in modern TF2 history. Well, modern enough. This one update introduced many quality of life changes like building uber faster in setup time, receiving health for extinguishing teammates, but only for Pyro, and that one mechanic that spy mains absolutely despise. But this was also the update to reduce the original weapon switch speed to half a second. This one change made encounters much more fast-paced. But as for Pyro, there was a much more complicated result. The degreaser was the only weapon to be able to combo against enemy pyros, but the modern switch speed made it possible on every single flamethrower. This made the degreaser more or less a crutch at performing such a niche task, which sadly brings me to the changes this weapon took. For starters, the meaningless damage penalty the weapon had just vanished into thin air and was replaced with an increase to the afterburn penalty. The weapon also received a slight increase to the weapon's air blast cost, which is absolutely comedic. But the change that I'm most interested in has to do with its switch speed. No longer was it universal, instead being just to and from the degreaser. And because of Tough Break's reduced switch speed, the amount was also tweaked. The new amounts were 60% to and 30% from the degreaser, which funnily enough was a slight buff when switching to the weapon. This was a bizarre way to balance the weapon out. By all means, it was a nerf, but it didn't exactly fix an underlying issue. The degreaser was still in this weird, overgeneralized state within Pyro's vast weaponry. And if you combine that with whatever the fuck was going on with the extinguisher over the years, it seemed like Valve wanted to balance combos on Pyro, but didn't have a clear idea of what exactly to do with them. But surely this upcoming Pyro balance update will work out all the kinks with the degreaser and its troubling usage, right? Would you believe that these updates didn't even tweak anything about the degreaser? Well, that's not entirely true, as it technically received an accidental nerf. This is because Jungle Inferno reworked Afterburn. For flamethrowers specifically, the duration of Afterburn was now based on how long someone was on fire. So to compensate for the rather lacking duration, the base Afterburn damage per tick was increased. And if we draw our attention to the degreaser's Afterburn penalty, you'll notice something. That's right, they never updated the displayed penalty to what it is now. It's a small gripe, I know, but just something I find bizarre after an entire rebalance of the class. But aside from that, the weapon itself is identical, with mechanics surrounding it being changed, like the aforementioned Afterburn and the booty blasting air blast. Either way, the degreaser could easily be seen as Pyro's superior flamethrower, which, come to think of it, why would you even bother using stock? It's a silly question on the surface, but when you boil it down, there's only a couple reasons why stock can still be the better overall option, which I'll share my thoughts on now. The major one being how much the Afterburn penalty actually affects gameplay, which I can understand to a degree. If your only source of Afterburn is the degreaser, of course this penalty will feel more apparent, but people seem to have forgotten that because of this Afterburn rework, flamethrowers are not good for long-lasting Afterburn. In order to even potentially dish out a significant Afterburn duration, you not only need to set your target on fire for a good chunk of time so that enough particles can hit and maximize that duration, but at that point, why not just burn them to death? And even if you get out alive with your target still burning, there are just so many ways to extinguish yourself and teammates that Afterburn is more or less an annoyance than anything else. But not only that, if you're using any of the flare guns or even the rather exotic options, they are completely unaffected by the degreaser's Afterburn penalty and deal a consistent duration based on if the target was already on fire or not. The other reason is it's slightly more expensive expensive air blast costs, which I'm a bit mixed on. I feel like it is your responsibility to learn when and where you can retreat to refill your ammo before you get into a sticky situation. Plus, if you're spamming mouse 2, regardless of what flamethrower you're using, your ammo's gonna deplete fast. And I do not think that 5 extra ammo per air blast is gonna make that much of an impact if you play smart. I cannot say that the Degreaser is definitively a direct upgrade to stock, but given that its penalties can be negated relatively easily, there are just too few reasons to actually use stock. But there's been one thing that I've wondered about for a while now. Why would you even bother using the Degreaser for combos anymore? It's not like they are particularly powerful anymore, especially with the Extinguisher's most recent rework. As of now, if the target is burning, it will deal mini crit damage plus the target's remaining afterburn when hit, which also extinguishes them if the blow is not fatal. It's a neat concept, but from experience, it really doesn't do that much damage, especially for the effort needed to secure a kill with it. The only other decent option for damage is the flare gun, dealing a flat 90 damage critical hit, plus the potential for max afterburn, which is great, don't get me wrong, but it's only going to serve a significant effect once the opponent is far away from your flamethrower's range. Going back to the question at the beginning of this video, what exactly made the Degreaser so dead? Well, by definition, nothing. It is undeniably one of the strongest and most versatile unlocks for Pyro, but because it could be used in so many different ways, the weapon never truly got to fit snugly within Pyro's unlocks, instead becoming the superior option for general Pyro gameplay, and that's what really killed it for me, which is honestly a shame, as the weapon in its initial state allowed for Pyro to have some serious offense potential, which I still deem to be one of the most unique ways for Pyro to be played. But no matter what may happen to the weapon in the future, there will be no way to recapture the same burning flame that was the original Degreaser. But hey, at least we have an archive of what could be done with such a weapon. It's just a shame that they're a goddamn VTuber!